All right, everybody, welcome back to the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs. We're here this Wednesday afternoon, January 17th. We're going to start our afternoon session with a little committee discussion about some of the items that we've been asked to weigh in on for the Budget Adjustment Act, which is currently being worked on across the hall in House Appropriations. So I had a little to-do list for us. And I think most of the things in terms of items were captured in requests from the treasurer's office. And they had a number of recommendations for the BAA. Some of them are not totally in our policy jurisdiction. So the things I was thinking we would weigh in on after that testimony. The first one, there were some technical changes to the Vermont Saves. That was number 2 on the memo that Gavin gave us. And I think that's under my name on the legislative page today, but that was the memo from the treasurer's office to House of Approps. The Vermont Saves technical changes, a little bit of a change in the enabling languages and some effective date changes. It didn't seem like there were substantive. So did anybody have any concerns about that one? We can go ahead and check that off as tell House Appropriations to listen to the treasurer's recommendations on that.
I think we thought you were talking to yourself.
Trying to just, get spark committee discussion, give everybody a chance to weigh in. I'm just supposed to send a memo over to them about Budget Adjustment Act. Most of these things are not huge policy changes. One item we did talk about a little bit while the treasurer's folks were here was the increase in the benefit for the Emergency Personnel Survivors Benefit Fund. And I know Representative Higley, you had a question that Ashland, I think, tried to answer about, why law enforcement's not included. So were you able to dig into that anymore?
I wasn't. And again, my only concern was, with that 160,000 that's in there now, raising that to 80,000 would just, take care of 2 folks in the long term. Anyway, I don't really have a problem with it. I just wish I had more information on why law enforcement wasn't originally included or couldn't be put forward.
That the hypothesis was that most law enforcement are full-time and with their negotiated benefits have some kind of a death benefit. But I don't know that we ever got anything really definitive on that from anybody other than the speculation from the treasurer's staff.
Ledge Council did tell me, Damien told me that all those groups have a federal death benefit. So this current one that's covering firefighters and EMS is above and beyond what the feds benefit is.
So would it be fair for me to characterize in our memo to House of Approps that we don't have any problem with increasing the benefit, but that we think it's worth looking into whether or not law enforcement should be included in that?
Absolutely.
Do we have higher police up here?
Fire police. So folks who are law enforcement but assigned to fire?
I get the idea that they're like volunteer members of the fire departments that direct traffic and do that kind of stuff. Fire.
You mean to qualify for the benefit, the volunteer?
Well, I'm just wondering if they're here, then they're.
And I also, just for the record, this isn't requesting any additional appropriation. I think we heard from the treasurer's office, there had been one payment made from the fund. There was an appropriation 8 or 9 years ago, it sounded like.
2016.
Yeah.
For the full 50,000.
And that was the last time there was actually an application, and it didn't sound like there had been any other applications to the fund. Okay, so if I will try to characterize the line of inquiry, but
No, I think that's all fine.
absent any objection from the committee, we'll sort of check that off. I think the first really substantive issue, and which takes up the bulk of this memo, has to do with the COLA calculation that we've talked about a couple of times. And so I wanted to get kind of a final opportunity here for the committee to weigh in on the following up on that one-time 9.5 million now, which has a net 9.3 effect on this BAA request. Sounds like to resolve the high inflation issue that came from the year before last.
And again, I think I mentioned this yesterday, but that 9.1 that came out of the reserve fund may or may not be sufficient. It all depends on what happens in the next few weeks, right? Whereas,
Chris, can I maybe ask you to help us with this, if you don't mind coming up and testifying yet, please?
Good afternoon, everyone. Chris Rickwood, Fiscal. To Representative Higley's question, I'm just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to use the $9.5 million figure because that's what the actuaries most recently costed out. What that represents is the actuaries run models through, they call it stochastic modeling, where they predict like a gazillion different possible economic situations happening to get at the probability of various situations occurring in the future. They ran this proposed change through those models, and the number that came out was the $9.5 million would represent the present value of what the actuaries estimate the cost would be to changing it moving forward. So what that 9.5 essentially means is that's quantifying the risk calculation. So that's saying if we put 9.5 million aside now into the pension fund, based on their modeling, and again, nobody can predict the future with any real accuracy, but their models are pretty good. They say that the sort of cost of funding that change up front would be $9.5 million. In sort of simple terms, I think about this in terms of, would you rather be earning interest or paying interest? If you paid the 9.5 million upfront at the time you make the change, you will be earning interest on that money over time, which would theoretically be sufficient to pay any adverse cost that might hit the fund based on their modeling and their probabilities. If you were to make the change and not put the money in, that would be the equivalent of paying interest instead of earning interest. So that's like putting the risk on the state's credit card and paying that cost back with 7% interest over time. So can I guarantee you that there will always be inflation exactly in line with assumptions moving forward? No. But based on the best available data we have from the actuaries' models, when they costed out the likelihood of various inflationary situations happening in the future, the number they arrived at was $9.5 million would be needed to fund the present value of those future benefits.
Absent any objection, I will say that it's our committee's understanding that if we approve this, it will essentially push that conversation to bed. And so we're going to go with the treasurer's recommendation on that. Yes, Representative Nugent.
Maybe a dumb question, so I'm sorry if, but I'm just thinking, did we do this last year also? Are we doing this twice?
That's not a dumb question.
Okay.
So, and I'm glad you asked it. So this your memory is exactly right. Last year about this time, you all had a conversation around what to do. And where folks landed in the legislature was they didn't want to make the change at that time because the experience studies were about to happen. And the pension systems do these experience studies every 3 years, and that's when they true up the assumptions. So concern was, all right, we have a price tag. Is that price tag going to change in a few months after the studies? So where you all landed was putting some pretty strong intent language in the budget last year that directed the treasurer to do exactly what he did, which was rerun the analysis. You all fenced off $9.1 million in reserve in the ed fund to have money to fund the future change once, the experience studies were done and you had a revised cost estimate, and to deal with the 1 year of really crazy high inflation. Instead of making the change, then a one-time payment was made to retirees. So $3 million from the ed fund was appropriated to make those one-time payments. When the actual price tag came in a little bit less, and there was a $160,000 sort of surplus payment that can be credited to that $9.5 million. So really the net you're looking at is 9.34 to make the full change. So 9.5 minus the 160 already there gets you 9.34. But no, your memory's very good. This is not a new issue. The sort of a pin was put in this last year to defer a decision until now.
And I think it would be fair to categorize after what we heard at the Joint Pension Oversight Committee. The experience study largely was positive in terms of the long-term effects of all the various decisions we've made over the last couple of years and the pension work that we did. So this is sort of a side issue of this interpretation of what happens when there's a year of particularly high inflation. I think we're hopefully unlikely to see above 5% inflation for the foreseeable future. I think everyone would appreciate that. But we've at least resolved that for recent past. Okay. I think I've got pretty solid footing on that from you all. So thanks everybody for going back in time and putting a bow on that conversation from last year. And then, so the next item that's on the list of things I've been asked to weigh on, we have been from House Appropriations, has to do with the Public Safety Communications Task Force language. So there's the language itself. Maria had drafted it and was in here yesterday at 1. That language is posted under my name today just to get it back in front of everybody with today's date, but it was under Maria's name yesterday. So this updates the budget language that was passed. Wondering if folks wanted to open it up for a little bit of a discussion about this and if there are any other items we might want to recommend that we work with House Appropriations on for this.
Where do we find that?
So it's under, if it's today's date, it's under my name, actually. It says proposed BAA language for Public Safety Communication Task Force.
The documents.
That should be on today's.
Yep.
Yeah. I just asked Andrea to repost it under my name just so it would be handy. Maria walked through it briefly yesterday with us, but the language they're looking at right now was supported by the Department of Public Safety. Commissioner Morrison was here with Executive Director Neal, and in my conversations with Representative Harrison, he's got this part of the budget. Sort of key things here is that it essentially preserves the same funding framework. I think it would be fair to say that we would have hoped that the Public Safety Communications Task Force would have been able to get a lot further along by this point. I think in many ways, the testimony we heard from Commissioner Morrison had to do with, the RFPs around the subject matter experts had to be refiled reposted rather a couple of times. So there were issues with the RFPs for the project manager and then the subject matter experts, they executed, Mr. Morrison executed a contract with a project manager. So they're just kind of starting to actually do any real work, but they did a ton of work trying to make decisions about who they were going to hire. And they met, I don't know, upwards of 30 times. This language that's before us really just extends the ability for them to use the state. Recall that we've been hanging on to $11 million for the purposes of dispatch and public safety communications for a while. We authorized an initial 1 million last year, plus potentially going up to another million if joint fiscal approves. So that's kind of just extended and preserved here with the technical change. And then the 4.5 million that would be available to fund pilot projects. The testimony you heard over the last week or so was that Public Safety Communications Task Force was not recommending that we fund the pilot projects until we had standards established for what communications technologies and standards for interoperability and all of that. So they've got a ton of work ahead of them. I'm wondering if anybody, before we talk about the other piece of funding, if anybody has any questions about this specific language, which I think just kind of kicks the conversation. Go ahead, Representative.
Thank you. Sorry for not being here for all of the testimony. 4.5 million is available for future use. It kind of like just holds that for.
Yeah, so the way that this language read and still continues to read is that there's the state money that we had set aside for regional dispatch is 11 million. An initial 1 million plus another million, if approved by joint fiscal, could be used for the analysis and planning. So that's paragraph 1. And then in paragraph 2, 4.5 million of that 11 million, so we're still dealing with the total 11 million, up to that could be available to provide funding for pilot projects.
And what about that 7 million from the federal? That's totally separate from this. Could that be used for some of this?
So this is what I really wanted to talk about with you
Okay.
all today. So recall last year, we were really excited about the idea that there was 11 million in state money and 9 million actually
Oh,
in
okay.
the federal money. And I think we've heard Commissioner Morrison talk about this a couple of times, and she's summarized this as we all really wanted to sub-grant that. The idea was we would sub-grant that out to pilot projects that were ready to stand up regional public safety communications, regional dispatch. Problem is the money came through the federal COPS grant, and that came with a whole bunch of strings attached from what we heard. The commissioner made it pretty clear to us last week and reiterated this in brief yesterday that 9 million is sort of, we can't use it for what we thought we were going to. And we asked her some questions about, and I think Representative Hooper had asked some questions about, okay, so can we use it in a way that is actually going to work with the future that you're planning with all of this planning exercise we're doing? If we have that 9 million, don't we want it to be spent on things that will work in concert with whatever standards you set up? And the commissioner kind of said, this money was granted to the Department of Public Safety and it's the department's money. I think it might be worth it, based on conversations I've had in and out of this room, for us to think about as we make our recommendation across the hall, coming up with some language that tries to get the Public Safety Task Force to actually work with DPS to make sure that money gets spent in a way that, will have a high likelihood of being compatible with the recommendations they make, where there's statewide dispatch that has fallover and interoperability and all of that. So I'm gonna throw that on the table. Should we try to do anything with that 9 million?
She had, if I remember correctly, she said they were gonna spend the majority of it on, radios.
Yeah, land mobile radio systems, yeah, and the infrastructure that supports it, towers.
Right.
Solar backup for,
So, I mean, I have a lot of questions about that in general, like, do they require maintenance over the years? Is it part of that money for buying like physical stuff and then saving part of it for later on? And if so, where did that come out of future budget? Like, it seems like to say this is the only thing that we can buy with this money when they don't know nothing. They have an idea of what some possibilities are of what they might do with it. So I guess she would probably be a better person to ask. Would be, how can we see if there's like, in the Venn diagram of this money and then what we're gonna need, like what that overlapping part is? And not just say, we're gonna guess that we're probably always gonna use these kinds of radios, and so we'll just get some.
yeah, so it's the thing that we have to weigh is
Right.
that anything we do to hinder the Department of Public Safety from spending the money,
We don't wanna do that.
well, my fear is just that if they don't do it by the end of 2024, it is gone.
Right,
So I think I'd wanna have the task force, since they're active and working, if I was gonna throw a policy idea out on the table for the BAA language, would be to say the Public Safety Communications Task Force should sign off on the plan prior to the contracts being signed on however that 9 million goes out. And so, I think we could work with Representative Harrison and Commissioner Morrison to figure out a way to make that work. But I think as it stands right now, if we did nothing, I think Commissioner Morrison and her department are just gonna spend the money as best they can and try to come up with a plan, and it's just gonna be done. And many people in this building have expressed a concern about just kind of letting that $9 million go. I had a lot of, I think anybody who's been paying attention to this issue for the last couple of years has really been counting on that 9 million being part of the kind of down payment on the future of regional dispatch. Representative Chase.
You had your hand up first. Oh, I'm sorry. And just from a technology perspective and IT projects, I've seen sunk costs used to justify continuing down a less than ideal path in the past. So, I don't want to see them spend it just for the sake of spending it, if that's going to lock us into something that's we're gonna have to undo later, and because that money has been spent, there will be even more resistance to changing the path that has been chosen ad hoc. And I say that ad hoc, I'm not implying that they would do less than due diligence. I'm just saying that if they have not come to the complete conclusion of their investigation, they might select a path that turns out to be not the one that we would select with full information.
Thank you. Again, forgive me for not being able to keep the task forces straight, who's on who. Who's on which one. Do you foresee that this communications task force would have a different idea for that $9 million?
I think that the challenge, without any disrespect to Commissioner Morrison, she's the co-chair of the Public Safety Communications Task Force we set up, right? And what she told us last week was the $9 million COPS grant money, it's just DPSs. It was granted to DPS, and we're gonna, try to use it as effectively as we can, and we're just gonna do it. And I think there might be some value in considering having the task force be involved in the decision about exactly how that money gets spent, with an eye toward really spending it on the things that, and I think the commissioner's right. Land mobile radio is almost certainly going to be a key part of the public safety telecommunications future. But I think it's just a question of, does that money, if we don't do anything, that $9 million has no relationship directly to the Public Safety Communications Task Force, except for Commissioner Morrison herself, because she's the co-chair and
So that came from,
DPS has that money.
that came from her, from a DPS perspective and not from the task force. I think that's where I was getting confused.
Yeah, and she and Barb Neal, who's the executive director of E911 board, they came together, and Commissioner Morrison's assertion was, this 9 million is really DPS's money. And I think a couple of us were like, can't we make sure that it really is going to work with the future? And so we don't have a whole lot of cards to play here in General Assembly to make sure of that, because the clock is running out. We've essentially run out the clock on the grant. But I think it might be worth in the BAA having the Public Safety Communications Task Force have some sign off if we can negotiate
I
that.
agree with that.
Can I follow up just for a second? So the task force has not been tasked with that $9 million. They have not been tasked to find a use for that 9 million.
That's a little complicated.
That's what I'm asking.
Yeah, so I think everyone a year ago, when we were looking at the budget language that authorized the task force and set the alternative to moving forward with the entire regional dispatch proposal that had come out of Senate Gov Ops, everyone was thinking of $20 million, 11 state, 9 federal, being able to be used for this stuff.
Mhm.
And then last summer, and Commissioner Morrison testified to this last week, I think, in here, that they tried so hard to get approval to be able to use that federal money to subgrant it to pilot projects and, other entities that might be able to use it. And because of the federal, strings attached or the regulations attached to that specific COPS grant funding stream, she just could not get the flexibility that we all thought she had had. So everyone was thinking, that was digging into that budget language, there's 20 million here. And now it's only 11 million state, and the 9 million is sort of sailing off into the sunset or going nowhere if DPS can't use it fast. So this is our last kind of opportunity to say, hey, DPS, can you just check in with the task force?
That was the missing link for me. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, it's been a
it's
long
okay.
and complicated tale.
I'm really sorry, because I'm sure I missed some of the testimony.
It's been a saga over the last year plus many years, but this particular chapter. So it sounds like there's some consensus that we should try to tie the 9 million to the task force if we can. Okay, I will say that is an item I will leave open over the when I send the memo on this other stuff that we've checked off. I want to move on from this for now, so I will not close that item with the BAA, and I'll see if we can come up. So we'll talk to Commissioner Morrison and our friends in House of Probes about if there's some additional language we can do. Thank you all. That was wonderful. So one last thing with BAA, switching gears a new thing. So I want to invite Bryn to take the witness chair here. Did you have any document for us?
I don't have a document for you. I'm glad to make one. If you'd like one for your website, I'm glad to put this into a memo. I just didn't have time to do it before I came over today.
Well, I don't know exactly what you're going to tell us, so.
Let me know if it would be helpful to follow up with a memo, and I'd be glad to.
Great, thanks.
So for the record, Bryn Hare, Executive Director of the Cannabis Control Board, here with the BAA request of 2 additional compliance positions. And I'm happy to give some context to this ask, and I'll answer obviously, any questions the committee has. But I just wanted to start with a reminder that the board essentially came in to request staffing positions in 2022. We were originally granted 4 positions to administer the adult use, medical use, and hemp-derived cannabis or hemp-derived programs. And when I initially came in to make my staffing request in 2022, it was really based on a look at what other adult use cannabis states, how they staffed their regulatory agencies. So our ask essentially for our team was sort of on the low end of what other states were using to administer their adult use cannabis programs. And I would note at this point that we are more aware than ever of how it really is not an apples to apples comparison. Vermont's adult use cannabis market looks very, I mean, as this committee knows, I think pretty well, we look really different from other adult use states. The legislature directed us to focus on small businesses, to focus on transitioning the illicit market into the regulated market. When Pepper was here last week, when the chair was here last week, I think he gave a little bit of a market update to show the committee sort of how successful we've been in doing that. The vast majority of our licensees are the tier 1 cultivators who are growing essentially on 1,000 square feet or less. And what I'd like to tell you about these folks is that for the most part, these are sole proprietors. They are people who are growing cannabis and also responsible for ensuring that they are maintaining compliance with a really complex framework of regulations that the state has put in place for them. So just to be frank about it, these are not people who have a in-house counsel or have a lawyer that is helping them with the process. They don't have a regulatory expert on staff. We are acting as that person for these businesses. And we see it as very much a part of our mandate to transition the illicit market into the regulated market to provide the support for our licensees. So that's just at the outset, I want to note that your regulatory agency is really doing quite a bit of hand-holding, technical assistance, business assistance. We are on call for these businesses sort of around the clock to help them maintain compliance. And our approach is really an education first approach to compliance. We are trying to assist these businesses to help them understand what the regulatory framework means and how they can achieve compliance, as opposed to just hitting these businesses over and over with notices of violation. Our approach really is to educate people first. And I would say I think that that's working pretty well. However, when I initially made this ask, I would say that the ask was really on the low end for the compliance team. So given what we know now about who our regulated industry are, who the players in the market are, it's become clear to me that we need some more compliance support. So just a couple of things to provide a little bit more context. In the first year that the cannabis industry was up and running, we issued sort of a handful of compliance actions. In the last 2 months, we have issued double the number that we issued in the first full year. And that really makes sense. I don't think it's indicative of a problem. It's indicative of where we are in the life cycle of the industry. We started issuing licenses in May of 2022. We're almost 2 years in now to issuing licenses. The retail market has been open for a little bit more than a year. So I think in our year 1, our businesses were really focused on getting licensed, getting up and running. And now we have operators who have been operating for a year. They're going through renewal. And I think now our focus really needs to sort of expand to encompass how do we make sure all of these licensed businesses, we've got 550 of them and double that many employees. How are we making sure that all of these operators are maintaining compliance with what is arguably a pretty complex and intensive set of regulations? And I would note that those regulations are nearly all oriented to consumer safety and public safety as directed by the legislature. So these are, these are not frivolous regulations. These are not paperwork regulations. These are regulations that really have a direct impact on the safety of the people who are participating in the market and the safety of the consumers who are engaging in the market. So I think, you know, as I noted, sort of like to best serve the people who are applying to become a licensee and our licensees, we are really taking like a case management style approach so that each one of our compliance agents has a geographic territory of the state that they cover. And a licensee or an applicant that lives in that territory or is going to open a business in that territory is assigned a licensing agent, or sorry, a field agent, assigned a compliance agent. And that compliance agent is the one that's providing not only going out to do the inspection of the business to make sure the business is appropriate for being licensed or appropriate for renewal, but they're also doing investigations involving that business. They're providing technical support, regulatory support. They're providing a lot of handholding to each one of these businesses. So our proposal is that we add one additional field agent. We have 6 right now. Their caseload, as I'm calling it, is really about 100 licensees per field agent. We have new applicants who are applying all of the time, so that number is sort of growing all the time. And I'm trying to get that number a little closer to set, given the amount of work that these folks that the field agents are doing. Each site visit, for example, takes 3 hours. Each site gets a visit at least once. By our rule, they get a site visit once a year. They're getting a site visit more like 2 or 3 times a year. So in addition to the site visits and that kind of work, they've got, you know, their investigations and everything else. I'm trying to get that number closer to 75 licensees per field agent. So adding one additional field agent will sort of expand the capacity of our compliance staff. The other ask, I'm asking for 2 positions. So one is a field agent. The other is a deputy compliance director. So right now, the way our staffing structure is and our organizational chart is in that market update that the chair gave to the committee last week. Right now, we have a director of compliance who supervises the 6 field staff. We don't have a deputy director. So what this means is all of our compliance actions that we're drafting right now, and that includes everything from a notice of violation to a corrective action plan, which is sort of a, the education first approach, bringing people into compliance, cease and desist letters, health and safety orders, the whole gamut of like enforcement actions that we can take with a licensee. They're all being drafted by our general counsel right now. And our general counsel has many, many other things to do. And will likely be absorbed in a Supreme Court appeal of a board decision within the year. We have had a couple of appeals of board decisions, and one has gone to the Supreme Court. So having a deputy director will allow us to have some additional staffing of people of a person who can really churn out these compliance actions and make us much more nimble in our response to complaints that arise, investigations that need to be undertaken, compliance actions out the door, educational materials out the door. Right now, we really are, I would say we are still really a skeleton crew of staff, given the sort of enormity of our mandate. So I think 2 additional compliance positions would really support the board in being able to best support our regulated community and continue our mandate of transitioning the illicit market into the regulated market. And happy to answer any questions about this ask.
For Brandon. Representative.
This really isn't in our corner, I don't believe, but the funding for those 2 folks that you're looking for, is that through sales of the product as well, or is it a different ask?
No, the way that our funding mechanism is set up right now, and I think this was also a part of the slide deck that the chair went through with you, is that effective in FY24, all of the excise tax revenue that's generated from the sale of adult use cannabis products goes first to the Cannabis Regulation Fund. So it does support the work of the board in maintaining and administering the programs, the adult use cannabis program. So yes, I would say that the revenue that's generated from the sales of this product is going to support the regulatory function. We also generate fee revenue from issuing licenses and from the enforcement actions that I mentioned. In the 2 years since we've begun issuing licenses, just under 2 years, we've generated $3.75 million in fee revenue. So that does not support the entire budget of the agency. But it was, intentional on the part of the legislature to direct that excise tax revenue first to the Cannabis Regulation Fund is how the regulatory agency is funded. I believe in every other adult use cannabis regulated state that a portion of the revenue that's generated by the industry goes to support the regulatory function of the agency.
And I guess another follow-up question that I noticed, and I'm sorry, I don't have my notes in front of me, but there was quite a substantial decrease in a lot of those fees for growers and license holders and so on. Do you feel that that's going to be an adverse effect on all that as well? Or do you just think that with the number increasing, you're going to have that same availability of funds?
So I'll note that we were tasked before we started issuing licenses, we were tasked with coming into the legislature with a fee structure proposal. And it's true that the original directive from the legislature was come up with a fee proposal that covers all of your regulatory costs. We did that. We actually came in with 3 separate fee structure proposals, one that would have covered our costs. But we recommended against that proposal, given that it would have kept most of the illicit cannabis market in the illicit cannabis market. It would not have been conducive to shifting the illicit market into the regulated market, given that the fees were so high. So the legislature opted to go with a different fee structure, which lowered sort of the barriers to entry to some degree. But I think the legislature thought it struck the right balance with trying to generate as much fee revenue as possible to cover the regulatory costs, but also acknowledge that there were other policy initiatives at work here, most importantly to get the illicit market into the regulated market to make sure that the cannabis industry was safe. So there haven't been fee decreases since the fee proposal was adopted by the legislature. I know that we are suggesting a fee decrease on the medical cannabis side, but not on the adult use side at this point.
What's the timeline like? So if this was approved in the BAA, and assuming that actually becomes law like April or May, do you think that makes a significant difference in terms of, being able to staff those positions versus it happening in the regular FY25 budget?
As soon as we have the authorization, we start doing the work with HR to get the position created and then to hire for it. I think it's always better if we have more time, and we are always better able to implement our mandate if we have additional staff. So I think that having that additional time would support us. If there is a reason to put it into the budget bill instead, that is also fine by us.
Questions for Bryn? Is there a specific number attached to the budget ask for those 2 positions?
Yes, we're estimating it at approximately 175,000 per year for those 2 positions.
Am I right in hearing Chair Pepper's testimony from the other day that we're pretty far ahead in terms of the amount of revenue that's coming in at this point in the?
I would say we are fee revenue and excise tax revenue are slightly above our initial projections, given the sort of robustness of the interest in the participating in the industry.
Representative Waters-Evans.
Thank you. I was wondering, what is the adverse effect of not having these 2 positions right now? Like, I understand that people are overworked, but is there
I think that that's a great question. I would say that the agency is not as nimble as it needs to be in responding to sort of the myriad compliance issues that are coming up every day. And given where we are in the lifespan, I think we've got it's sort of a critical moment for us to be very quick in responding to complaints and responding to legitimate compliance issues that are coming up. And also, I think it positions us. We're sort of we don't want to be caught on the back foot when maybe a bigger compliance action needs to be addressed. So I would say there's a lot of little things that are percolating that need quickly to be responded to. And we also want to make sure that we are ready for when that bigger compliance action comes to pass, which it inevitably will, given that the market is maturing.
Representative Byron. Something.
And not a question, but I just wanted to speak to a more of a, I appreciate this ask. Chair McCarthy and I did a couple of different field trips over the off session to some facilities, talk to different retail people, different operations. And I'm very enthused that things are going well. You're seeing a good amount of licensures go out. But the staff capacity, I think, is important as this grows. We're at a very key juncture here with the industry. So I just wanted to thank you for coming in with the ask. And at least right now in this opening conversation, I think it's totally reasonable.
Representative Pena.
Thank you. I just wondered if we have any comparison at all, or if we can make any comparison to liquor and lottery and their compliance agents.
I can certainly do that. I can create a comparison for the committee. That would be helpful.
It'd be interesting to know, because, I mean, obviously, those are established industries where presumably more rulemaking has already happened and businesses understand maybe a little bit better what's expected of them. But it just seems like we're continually adding positions, and we have other vacant positions that need to be filled and little money to do it with. So I want to make sure we're putting the money where it's really necessary. It's a good point.
I think the one thing I would note to your point, and I will certainly get that comparison to the committee, is just as you point out how different the two industries are. We've got one that really is very nascent. It's a brand new sort of baby industry. And the majority of the folks that are operating in it really have very little experience operating in sort of a highly regulated industry. And so, and that's sort of why I led with the just painting a little bit of a picture of what our work looks like. It really is not just going in with checklists on a clipboard and checking things off. It's helping people to understand what is expected of them, and that is can be very intensive work, given the sort of like around the clock nature of these businesses. They, many of our sole proprietors are out there in their gardens, and then at night they're coming in and saying, wait, what do I have to do? And they're in touch with our field agents sort of at all hours of the day, and we're really providing that support. So it is a little bit, there is a difference in the two pathways. However, I'm happy to give you those numbers regardless.
So take one more question, and then I think what will be committee is also put this in the BA parking lot with the communication task force language that we just talked about, and do a little bit of follow-up, and if Brent can get us a little bit of information about that comparison, that'd be great. So Representative Nugent, you have the last word.
I was sort of following up on Lisa's question, just curious, sorry, Representative Pena, about the number of licensees per compliance officer, because I know DLL also does two substances, and there's a whole bunch of new products that have come on the market. So I was wondering if you could speak to that, or if you knew just in general the ratio that you're looking for, or how it's working now.
Yeah, so as of right now, our ratio is a little bit over 100 licensees per field agent. And that's not inclusive of the new licensees that we're sort of adding every month. I don't know what the ratio is for DLL. I will find out. But I'm looking to get us closer to a 75 per field agent ratio. I think that's more appropriate for us, given the number of small operators we have in the state.
Brent, we will be in touch. Thank you for bringing this to us. I just want to make sure we heard this and could advise our colleagues across the hall.
Great. Thank you so much for hearing from me, and that's great to see you all.
Thank you. All right, everybody. My inclination is to turn our attention back to 6:49 and try to give everybody a few minutes before we have to get up to the floor, as opposed to breaking now. Unless anybody has any objection. I concur. So I think where we left off, was we were gonna touch on those other issues, so maybe, I don't know if Damien and Tucker, you wanna come back together, if that makes sense?
Did you just step out and Tucker?
Step out. Okay, so let's start with some of these open issues we were discussing earlier.
Yeah, and the revised draft is being edited, so when Tucker steps out, we want to swap back to that language, we could do that.
Great, I think so we're really focused in here on, section 9. We had asked in the draft that is being edited right now to put, items A and G aside, so those are the ones that are on page 9. The bill is introduced. And, I think while we're waiting for that draft, we can talk about, I think the first open question we had from this morning was item C. So we've talked a bit about this, but I wanted to really delve into the comparative discussion and the sort of unique request here around the ability to have a closed meeting. And I think Tucker heard a lot of the questions and concerns that had come up around this. So I'm wondering if you had a little context around the constitutional question, and if there are other examples of meetings of this nature.
Sure, always great to start from the top.
It is.
Right, that's what we always say, at least what I always try to relay in committee when we're talking about new issues. I believe that's how I started my kind of like reintroduction to the open meeting law before this bill was taken up by your committee. And one of the first things I noted is that the open meeting law does cite Article 6 of the Vermont Constitution. And that article says that all power being originally inherent in and consequently derived from the people, therefore all officers of government, whether legislative or executive, are their trustees and servants, and at all times in a legal way accountable to them. And the pronoun them is referring to the voters. The Supreme Court of Vermont has looked at Article 6 and has taken some open meeting law and Public Records Act challenges that have posed the question of whether this constitutional requirement can be imposed on public bodies or agencies of the state, absent some requirement in statute. And the Supreme Court of Vermont has said, and we covered this during the introduction, this is an aspirational article. It is not self-executing. It does not impose a specific duty or require something from the state. Access to meetings is something that the General Assembly has created in statute. So being verbose, but the response to your question, there is no constitutional obstacle to amending the open meeting law or even to creating special exceptions for certain state agencies or even local agencies. That was something that was raised earlier. Again, paraphrasing, I don't know if this was the exact quote, but it was something along the lines of you can't change the open meeting law to grant specific exceptions. You can, and you have, in a handful of occasions, when specific concerns have come up with other public bodies. The General Assembly has generally just granted a blanket exemption from the open meeting law for those agencies. So an example that I brought up, I believe, during the first discussion of this is the Victims' Compensation Board is not subject to the open meeting law. It was brought up in a different context earlier during Damien's testimony, but the community justice centers are not subject to the open meeting law. The Maternal Mortality Review Board is not subject to the open meeting. Hopefully that gives you some confidence to move forward with whatever policy choices you want to make about granting limited exemptions or changing some of the procedures or terms for how these meetings are held. Okay. Some of the confusion around subsection C might actually just be from the term being used here, closed meeting. Perhaps that's something the committee might want to look at, change the term there so that it doesn't get confused with executive sessions in the future. I I think you've gotten a walkthrough of what is happening here, but a closed meeting is really just a limited access meeting. Brings me to something else that I heard earlier during the testimony around public participation and rights to participation in meetings. The open meeting law in one VSA, section 312. In subsection, make sure I do it right this time, H, I believe is where we're gonna find this. I'm so good.
We do not disagree. You are humble too.
Yeah, my humility is my best quality. Subsection H, at an open meeting, the public shall be given a reasonable opportunity to express its opinions on matters considered by the public body during the meeting, as long as order is maintained. Public comment shall be subject to reasonable rules established by the chairperson. And of course, there's a carve out here, as we've talked about for quasi judicial proceedings, that public participation, these terms don't even bind those quasi judicial proceedings. Going back to some of the original testimony I provided on specific exemptions and carve outs in the open meeting law. Something to note, quasi judicial bodies are allowed to hold deliberative meetings that are not public. They're not subject to the open meeting law.
So that actually, that last thing that you covered was something that I really wanted to delve into. So there was quite a bit of conversation this morning and some of the testimony we heard that implied that this was an entirely unique thing that we were doing here, both closed meeting and around deliberations. So I wanted to back up just a little bit and talk and have a conversation with you about how do we have quasi, like what is a quasi judicial body? What are examples of that for the committee? And then how are they able to deliberate, and what is deliberating versus actually conducting business that needs to be before that needs to be part of a warned meeting that's public.
Examples of quasi judicial bodies, anytime you have an administrative agency that's hearing what's known as a contested case. So where a party is possibly subject to sanctions, you could think of like licensing reviews. I'm sure Damien can come up with some examples from the Department of Labor. They actually have quite a few quasi judicial bodies. They have what's known as administrative law judges, but think of those bodies as committees that are hearing a case very similar to how a court would hear a case.
Employment Security Board, OSHA Review Board, Development Review Board, although I think we call them something different now. But all of these are quasi judicial bodies where they would hear cases and controversies. So they could be appeals from an agency decision. It could be a dispute between neighbors over whether development is permitted. They act in place of the judiciary or in a similar manner to the judiciary before a case gets to the judiciary. So,
An example from municipal law you might be familiar with would be housing boards of review. So hearing challenges in the context of landlord-tenant law at the municipal level.
And so those quasi judicial bodies, they have the ability to render decisions that are appealable to the courts, but without going to the court, most of those decisions, they have the full effect of the law. So you can or can't build something in the case of some of the permit review boards you just mentioned. So here we're talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where their power is to gather stories and make a report. We would be saying that their work, that they were able, if we passed this language as introduced, would be able to do deliberations, but any actual decisions that they make and the reasons for that would have to be presented in an open hearing.
Right. A specific carve out for those those bodies that are dealing with quasi judicial proceedings. I don't necessarily want to just label them quasi judicial bodies. Is in 1 VSA 312, and it states that in 1 VSA 312, which is all the procedures for open meetings, shall extend to the deliberations of any public body in connection with a quasi judicial proceeding. And there is a definition of what deliberations are in this context in 1 VSA 310. I believe I read this verbatim the last time, but if I didn't, here we go with a straight text reading here. Weighing, examining, and discussing the reasons for and against an act or decision, but does not expressly include, or excuse me, expressly excludes the taking of evidence and the arguments of parties. That's specific to contested cases, right? But this is basically saying that deliberations include weighing, examining, and discussing the reasons for or against. So a quorum or more of members of a public body can deliberate in connection with a quasi-judicial proceeding and discuss, for example, the pros and cons of the case before them.
Representative Henke.
And to add on to that, it's without coming to a decision of
Correct.
the body.
Yes, yes, that would be public. There's some overlay here as well as worth noting with the Administrative Procedures Act and issues related to contested cases.
Trying to formulate this into a question, but Representative Higley, go ahead while I'm trying to figure out how to ask what I'm thinking.
I think what Tucker had said was the confusing terminology is closed meeting. And I'm just wondering what could be substituted there, whether it's, that there will be allowed quasi judicial proceedings. I mean, I don't know.
No, because it's not a quasi judicial proceeding that we are allowing. That would require a wholesale change to the powers of the commission.
Okay.
I mean, you could do that, but that was what we discussed this morning about how the legislature deliberately did not give them the power to make findings of fact and rulings on the stories that come between them, just the power to gather stories, not. So they're unlike, say, the again, Employment Security Board, where they take the case and decide if an individual should have been granted unemployment insurance or not. When the department makes a decision on that, they're gathering evidence, they weigh the evidence, they make findings of fact, and then they make a ruling based on the law. And then someone does or does not get a benefit based out of that. This group here is just gathering information. So you might want to consider something like limited access meeting. And then the question is, to what extent are you limiting access? You heard testimony this morning about a desire to provide additional avenues for the public to participate. And so your policy decision here is really around if you're looking at the original draft C1 in that section, defines closed meeting as a meeting that is live streamed and video recorded, but that is otherwise closed for purposes of physical or digital access and participation of the public. So you heard testimony this morning saying that there are concerns about limiting that ability of the public to participate. So that's a policy question for you there. Closed meeting, the term I agree is it's not a good one because it is easily confused. So you could change the terminology. Tucker, you want to jump in here?
I was just going to say that the term is actually my fault. I think they closed, I named my dog and my cat, so I'm not very creative.
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. My kids name their stuffed animals after the animal too. It's Bunny and Doggy and Kitty. So
You both are a little more punchy than usual.
it's when we're side by side like this. But yeah, so you could definitely change that terminology and you can change that definition depending on your policy decision, basically about what sort of access do you want to provide, if you even want to provide this right for the commission to do this. is there some sort of balance between the requests for allowing public participation and controlling threats to the commission, something like that. And I can't speak for either the commission or the press or any of the other advocates here as to what the right balance is. Just saying that that's an area where you can make a policy decision. You can also make a terminology change. But if you were to go down the quasi judicial route, that would be a wholesale change of the powers of the commission and raise a whole bunch of new questions. So.
Representative Hank.
So was there a problem with Tucker's suggestion of limited access meeting?
I don't get to make that decision, so.
I guess I'm not really helping you, Damien. I mean, something along those lines. I agree that closed is not a good term.
So I actually think there's two things. I actually like the idea of calling it a limited access meeting. So I don't know if anybody wants to weigh in, but to me, that's like the style. And I think it's good for us to communicate effectively to people reading this and to the public what we're actually talking about. Because I agree that the headline that we're closing meetings makes it sound like executive session. People's minds immediately went there. Everyone I talked to that read the article that had closed meeting in the headline was like, you guys are doing executive sessions. It's like, no, wait, no, stop. Don't interpret it that way. So I like that. I think the second thing though is, do we have the policy right on, so there has to be a finding of a material threat to safety. That's the language that we have here. And then the question I have is, are there any other examples of the powers? Is there an in-between, or is there a spectrum that we could ask the commission to consider when they are going into a closed or limited access meeting? So if they do meet the bar and they vote that there is a threat, is there a way that we could structure it so that there are either conditions on that folks are interested in? I'm trying to balance the desire not to create an entire new type of meeting with the reality that this particular commission has limited effective power to make legislative decisions or even quasi judicial decisions, but an enormous amount of potential interest, threat, exposure in a way that most of our other public bodies, the labor and development review boards aren't going to have the kind of threats that we've already seen the Truth and Reconciliation Commission receive.
Thank you. Just thinking back to the Zoom bombings that have happened when we first started meeting on Zoom, maybe an incident like that has to happen first, and then, or maybe an incident needs to happen like that where the meeting has to get stopped and then warned as a limited access meeting. So that happens, the live stream goes down and the meeting is essentially shut down, nobody's meeting. Then a different warned meeting will come out that we're going to resume where we left off, but it's going to be limited access. Or if there are ahead of time written or phoned in calls or notes that something is going to happen. Like we are going to disrupt, this particular group is going to disrupt your meeting on January 18th.
So I've got Representative Boyden and then Representative Chase.
I'm wondering if it's the intent of the language for after the threat had been, say, handled, that then the meeting would go from closed to back open, or it would just continue to be closed.
So, I think the way the language is written, it provides that essentially if the commission makes a finding that there's a material threat to the health or safety, then they may hold a quote closed meeting. So the entire meeting at that point would be a closed meeting. So it's not quite the same as an executive session where you'd move into executive session and move back out of it. When you're done discussing that, the entire meeting would be just it similar to the way the Zoom conversation here is. The people on Zoom are have a specific link and they're specifically invited. That's kind of the meeting there. It would be the members and the specifically invited people without the public coming into the meeting. So I think that is where we're at. It's not quite one of the, shifting gears from open meeting to closed meeting, threats passed, we're back to open meeting. The law doesn't read that way. It doesn't provide express authority to do that. Certainly the commission could limit the number of topics that are covered at the closed meeting or something like that, but that's in their discretion under the way the bill is written. I have to be really careful. I keep saying the law, I think, and I want to be clear. I'm talking about the bill, not the law. So I'm sorry, it has been a day.
Yeah.
So.
And if you want to come up so that you're on camera, Christine.
That my thought, and after, some of the things that we heard this morning. So
Sorry.
in a
could you
closed
introduce
meeting,
yourself again?
I'm sorry, Michelle O'Hara, General Legal Counsel for the commission. But in a closed meeting, the commission can invite, right? So it could be like in the public meeting law, there's some things that, you have to specifically invite press that has requested to be invited to meetings. So potentially, press that lets us know that they would like to come to the meeting and be invited to closed meetings. Right? And that seems like that'd be pretty simple. It's not the press that's giving threats. Right.
Yeah,
As
so
far as I know, it has not happened.
Representative Chase, go ahead.
From a cybersecurity perspective, I want to be cautious that we're not just creating a situation where anybody, like Zoom links are published and anybody can join as equal peers and potentially be putting other people at risk with links chat or whatever that would pose real and financial risk to Vermonters, the commission, everybody, et cetera. So if we're talking about open meeting online, having it be in a sort of situation where the public can participate, Q&A, raise their hands, whatever, but not just be able to take over control of the screen or what have you. If we're keeping a meeting open, I want to I'm sure the commission's exploring these things, but I don't want to create a situation that binds them to publishing the Zoom link for everybody and to join that as they wish, kind of thing.
Yeah, as it's written right now, there's if I'm reading this right, there's closed is digitally, it's live streamed and recorded, but people don't have the ability to directly participate without being invited. Which is exactly the situation from a digital perspective that we have in this committee that we're having right now. But our door physically is open to the public. So this is an open meeting in the sense that anybody can walk in here. And so I'm almost thinking that the ability to close the meeting digitally should follow the practice or that they should have the power that we sort of outline in when we are doing the more universal open meeting law. I guess the question, and this maybe is more one for Tucker than Damien, is are there circumstances right now where a meeting that doesn't have a physical location can be closed by a public body?
don't know the answer to that. Tucker's better able to answer questions on that.
Because I think as we look at this, the threat to the physical safety that the commission has brought to us makes me inclined to want to support their ability to close a meeting and maybe even have something specifically in here that, you know, encourages or prioritizes participation by, you know, known persons or trusted people like the press. But for the digital, I guess for the time being, I think their ability to close a meeting, I wanted to eventually us to adopt best practices. This is what we talked about putting a pin in when we did Act 1 last year. And, you know, I'm inclined to try to create a standard that different bodies use so that we're not doing this for every single board and commission. But it may be the best thing to do, given the limited nature of this particular commission's work, is to go ahead and allow them some leeway here in closing the meetings. But it's a serious thing for us to consider. Thoughts on that, Representative Byron?
I just kind of want to pick up on what I was saying a little bit earlier when the DPA was discussing this about the threats with the organization or with the board, the group, and what they're experiencing is these things are known in the moment, right? And I'm not saying this should be like a thing, very much what you were just into, but we have this very, we have some examples out there of people trying to, where there is a higher ratio of aggressive engagement from subsets of society. And I want to be very conscious of us trying to do this in a very tight scope. But I also personally don't want to not really do this in a way where this is guarded and have to react later if there's an unfortunate situation where, you know, it's not. So.
Or literally.
Yeah, it's a harsh reality of the world we live in right now. So I just want us all to be conscious.
Michelle, would it be safe to say that the alternative, if we didn't have closed meetings and there was a threat, so if we took this language out of the bill and passed the piece about filling the vacancy and everything else, that if there was a threat to the safety of the commission, they would have to weigh, is it safe enough for us to meet, or do we just not meet in a physical location? I guess I'm trying to imagine what happens if we don't. What are the consequences if we don't pass this? Is it going to completely hinder the commission from meeting?
Well, if online is an option, then obviously try to make that work, you know. I'm not sure what people would do. I think being responsible, we would have to tell people what they were getting into if they showed up. And that could be ugly. I think that, you know, what I was thinking, you know, there's just so many levels to this, but I want people to feel safe in coming and safe in sharing what they have to share, right? If we then, right, let's say we have these threats, we hold an online meeting, people show up and do their what via chat, right? People aren't going to want to show up again to the public meeting because it triggers people and they don't want to have that kind of ugliness or fear in online situations. That's why, like, the closed meeting is a good option to try to continue the work. If we could only meet physically and we had those threats, I really don't know what we would do. I mean, we would need to talk through that. And I don't know how you can ask, I don't know how I could ask my other commissioners to come under those circumstances.
Technical question. I know when you have a limited access meeting, you can disable the chat. What about doing that?
Right, you could just, you could be experiencing it in real time, right? And then if you're not behaving properly in the meeting, we have an ability to say goodbye to you. Yes, and I think it's possible that we could allow that to happen, knowing before the meeting that it might happen. And I'm just saying that that would give people, that might be tough to then, we'll lose some of the people. And I think it might be hard to get some of those people back. Yeah, I mean, you could just experience that online. That's a possibility. The thing is, if you have a threat beforehand and you know that people have ill will or whatever, do you really want to go into that maybe?
I guess I was asking, what about no chat?
Oh, eliminate the chat?
Eliminate the chat.
We did that for the legislature around Zoom.
Yeah, so if,
But then that's almost like a closed meeting, right? Then people can't participate.
well,
So,
you can still participate by raising your hand. If you're online, on the link, on the
Then you can
screen,
verbally get a threat.
you can raise your hand, and I think there's a way, I mean, there is a way, you can mute everybody and then unmute each person if they raise their hand, and if the first thing out of their mouth or the 10th thing out of their mouth is abusive, then you mute them. I mean, I don't know, I've never run a Zoom myself, but I'm just seeing that this could happen. Maybe.
I think those are options.
Representative Waters Evans and then Representative Chase.
Thank you. So as it stands right now, though, those options are all available, right? Even if we pass it the way it's written right now, because we removed that section about the physical requirement and all that stuff. So right now, everybody can meet on Zoom until,
July 1st or
yeah,
under whatever
okay.
extension we pass in a future bill.
And then I had a question about a different matter, but I can wait until we're done with this. Okay,
Yeah, if that's okay.
of course.
Come back. All right, Representative Chase, go ahead.
To Representative Hango's point, I would just like to make sure that we're structuring it in such a way that a limited participation Zoom where it's raise hands and send Q&A to the presenter sort of thing counts as an open meeting that allows public access without allowing access to other members of the public who may be vulnerable or something like that. So it would allow the participation role. The moderator of the meeting could act as kind of the gatekeeper for what is, who is unmuted, whose questions are published to the group, but without having that count as the closed meeting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I'm reluctant for us to get into that level of specificity in this bill. Because I want to get to that level of specificity in a bill that applies to all the meetings and even define some of the things that
For sure.
that you're putting out there. I mean, it's the conversation we didn't have time to have when we were up against town meeting last year. And so we just extended what we were doing, which, I think one of the discussions we'll have to have around the remote meeting authority has to do with, what are communities doing now? I mean, we have boards, commissions, select boards doing all kinds of different hybrid meetings with a different level, I think, in each one of openness and closeness when it comes to the ability for whoever's running that Zoom to mute it or, whatever electronic access they have. And setting some standards is really important. I don't know that we're going to be able to answer all those questions in the context of this bill. And so I'm inclined to err on the side of, for this particular commission, given the sensitive nature of what they're doing, trusting them to be responsible about it. And also creating that the bar is high. They have to have a real threat against their safety in order to close meetings. Representative Hanko.
Thank you. So then, I'm assuming we are going to have time to take up another bill that addresses
So,
open meetings.
Yeah, so right now the Senate's working on S-55.
Okay.
And S-55 is really the follow-on to Act One from last year. And, you know, when Senator Hardy and I were looking at all of the work that was before GovOps committees this year, since they had that bill on their wall and they'd indicated for a committee that they'd be willing to go first, they've already made some progress on that. And I expect we'll probably get it in 3 or 4 weeks in advance of crossover.
Okay, so were you thinking then of just taking a section of this out and just going with the July 1st deadline that allows for electronic meetings, digital meetings, but the hope that the commissioners are able to conduct their meetings in such a way that they can mitigate any threat that might come up between now and when a permanent bill is passed?
So it's an excellent segue to the edited new draft 1.1 that Damien put up, because if you look at section 9 of that, what we talked about before we broke for lunch was to take the language from the original section 9 that mirrored Act 1 and take that out of this bill so that whatever hybrid and remote access rules we end up with for July 1st and beyond, the commission would operate under the same rules as every other public body. Except for the time being in this draft, I wanted to consider these additional powers of being able to go into a quote unquote closed meeting, or if we change it to what I think is preferred branding of limited access, that section is still in here, which is the new section 9 sub A1. So there's a definition of a closed meeting. It sounds like there's some interest in changing that to limited access. The commission could find, if the commission finds upon a finding material threat, that they would be able to close a meeting. And then I think the question I have for Damien is, does that, from the digital side, their ability to close it would, if we passed this language as in draft 1.1, would be available up until July 1, and then they would still be able to close a meeting if we still have the authority presented to them to meet without a physical location and have a completely digital meeting or a hybrid meeting.
So, if you leave in I'll call it the limited access meeting provision now, that will still provide them with authority separate and apart from what's in Act 1 and what may be in S-55 as to holding digital meetings, or, meetings where the commission is present digitally but not in person or something like that. So this authority is separate. So if you're going to, there's I think 2 things at play here. One is, are you envisioning this authority to have some sort of limited access meeting extend past July 1? And if that's the case, then it probably makes sense to be more specific potentially about how you intend for that access to be limited and how you intend for it maybe not to be limited. So I know there are a lot of ideas going back and forth on the committee here, and how that's different from a meeting where they're present, where the members are not necessarily in person. So, like we're having now, where you can potentially have most or all of a board or commission present on Zoom, and that, there may be one person present in the room where the public is or something like that. And so they're doing some sort of hybrid meeting or something like that. I think that's probably for me, the big question, because this is really a separate authority. And as long as you've got the two, a court's gonna read it to say, well, the legislature enacted this separately, so they intended this to be separate. Unless you get rid of that in S55 or something like that. So did I answer your question? I'm not sure if I got everything.
No, I think I've got it. So if we. I think what I wanted to say, and I'm interested to hear what the committee says here, is I would want it to allow them. So if digital access, if a hybrid or a fully remote meeting is allowed by law, so it is right now under Act 1. That they will have the ability, if they find this, to close a meeting. So I want us to have the conversation about the virtue of remote meetings and physical locations universally. And I want the flexibility around closing those meetings to be specific to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I think that's, after hearing all the testimony up till now, that's kind of where I'm coming down, and I'm interested in hearing other people's thoughts about that. But for me, that feels like the best way to square the circle for now, is that we have the bigger conversation about remote meetings, but as long as there are remote or hybrid meetings allowed for public bodies, that we give the commission the flexibility to close those meetings if they find a material threat to their safety. Representative Waters Evans, do you have a question?
No, I mean, I guess I agree with you that as long as it's not creating a situation that lasts in perpetuity, independent of any other laws that we make, and that seems like the right way to handle it for now, right?
Yeah, I mean, after hearing the Tucker, it's like there's a whole bunch of slightly different bodies have slightly different duties and allowances and exemptions from public records and public meetings, and it's up to us to make those decisions together. Representative Hango.
Thank you. One comment and one question. The comment is that we probably should stop calling it a closed meeting and just start referring to it right now as a limited access meeting, because every time you say the word closed, I think of closed doors.
Amen.
And executive session. My question is, are you saying the same thing that Damien's saying? Because I almost think you're saying the opposite of what he's saying. Did you feel like the chair's explanation just now captured what you were suggesting, Damien?
I think we're on. If we're not on the exact same page, we're reading in the same direction.
Okay.
So I think what I'm understanding here is the chair wants to take the discussion of digital remote meetings out of this, put it into S55, and have a standard policy across the board. And then with this, there's the question of the limiting access to the meeting under specific circumstances. And so what I'm understanding is that that's the discussion here. In this specific instance, because of the specific challenges that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission faces. And then I think that's where we're at. And then the discussion is really about whether you keep the language as it is with the terminology changes, or whether you provide additional specificity or adjustments to how that access is limited.
Okay, so I think you are both on the same page now. And my question was going to be, what happens if S55 or some other bill does not pass a law allowing for electronic access? Will this, if it passes first, will this allow for this particular commission to be able to do that after July 1st?
So after July 1st, what you would have left is the limited access meeting. So, the way it's worded right now, it does not specifically provide for the meeting to be a digital or remote meeting. What it says is that and I'm gonna jump around a little bit, but the meeting is one that's live streamed and video recording, but that is otherwise closed for purposes of physical or digital access and participation of the public. And that probably should be physical or digital access or both, if that's your intent. Because right now, the way it reads is it's one or the other. And that's my fault. But it also says that then the commission can allow its staff, council, and persons who are subjects of the discussion or whose information is needed to access the closed meeting. So there's basically, it's not like just the commission sits in a room. But what would happen is after July 1st, the commission would need to be in the room. And so the way this is worded right now is that after July 1st, the commission would have a meeting location. People who were invited would be allowed into the room. Everyone else would be digital. Or alternatively, everyone would be allowed into the room and some people would be restricted from digital access. I can't imagine that happening. That really made sense in terms of the remote meetings, not in terms of a non-remote meeting if there's a threat to someone's health or safety. So this is going to need to change no matter what, to adjust to the possibility that S55 does or does not move in substantially similar form to what's in or what was in subsections A and B in the bill as introduced. So I would say for purposes of the committee, your discussion is really where are those policy parameters and what sort of authority do you want to give to the commission if you're going to give them this authority to limit access? How do you want to cabin that authority?
Do you think, Tim, that you would be able to capture what I was saying where this bill is agnostic about whether or not remote meetings are allowed, but that in the event that general law permits remote or hybrid meetings without a physical location or with a physical location, that with a finding that would allow the commission to close a meeting for a physical location, that they could also close it for digital location, and that we essentially make the power to close a digital meeting or limit access to a digital meeting. I'm really trying to change the lingo in real time here, Representative Hango, that power is really contingent on them being able to meet digitally at all.
Yeah, that's not hard to draft. So I can draft it so to say that to the extent that digital or remote meetings are permitted by law, and I'll get Tucker to help me with the language so I use the correct terminology. The commission may, and then we'll go from there. So I can do that. That's no problem at all. So,
committee, are there strong feelings about that? I'm trying to come up with a compromise here in real time, which is always dangerous to do live.
Love to see it in writing.
Yeah, well, we'll take a look at it tomorrow. We're going to pick this back up tomorrow. Representative Waters Evans.
I know that we have to go upstairs in a minute, but I have one more question. It's for Michelle, I think. So it says currently the new version of the bill says commissioners shall not participate in any meeting or session of a group established pursuant to this section. Right? That was.
Yeah, so we're switching gears.
I'm switching. Sorry, I know we were talking about that.
You
want to talk about that some more?
Nope. I think we got a direction there. I just wanted to make sure the committee understood that your question was about a totally
different matter. Yes, it's about the groups. So my question is, is it okay with the commissioners that they're not participating in those meetings? And then my question for Damien would be, does the word participate does this preclude them from moderating or facilitating or attending or like does that word or coordinating them, or you know what I mean? Does that word participate mean something specific? Or could they go and not talk? Could they like, sorry.
No, that's, you're,
But it seems like a
you're
broad
raising a
thing.
good point.
And
So-
maybe they want to go and they don't want to be in statute barred from participating.
So I can't speak for the commissioners, but I
Right.
can say that if you don't want them to attend, you just recognized a loophole in my language. So it should be attend or participate in. I'll defer to Michelle on the commissioner's position.
Yeah, I think that they probably would like to be allowed to go, but I think they're gonna recognize and understand people's concern that this would turn into a public meeting. And I think that they're gonna be able to live with it.
Because I guess maybe an alternative would be to say maybe one could go or is that
No more than one commissioner.
no more than one commissioner may attend at a
Like not,
time? or-
not a quorum.
Yeah, just to give them the option to attend or take turns attending the groups if they want to and report back to each other.
They would appreciate that. They can
Just
also
an option.
understand your decision either way.
Okay.
Yeah, I really appreciate, we feel very heard, and I know you're working on it. Thank you.
So it sounds like I'm kind of on top of the changes you've already made in 1.1, that we maybe further amend that section so that instead of an outright on commissioners participating, attending a group, that we say something to the effect that no quorum or not more than one, whatever the cleanest way to establish that is.
Not more than one. Do the same as staff too, like we were talking about maybe allowing staff.
I think we're silent on staff. I don't want to get into I don't want to.
No, that's fine. I just wanted to ask the question while we were doing this exercise.
No, but it's a great question. Sorry, I didn't give you down, Representative Byron. Representative Chase.
I would lean towards staying a quorum just in case we change the number of members at some point. So you
Smart man.
Look at us. It's a long game, boys.
It's Matt.
So I would recommend staying with not more than one. The reason I would say that is if you change the number of commissioners, we can change the number. But not more than one is clear. And if I'm it versus, for a person who's not used to reading laws, they see a quorum of commissioners may not attend. What the heck does that mean? They've never served on a public board. They may not understand quorum. Not more than one is very clear. So I would err on the side of clarity here and then just say, make us poor ledge council folks work a little harder and change that number too, if you decide to change the number of commissioners. So that's my advice, just for clarity's sake.
Representative Chase, others, how do you feel about?
I think that makes sense to me.
Seeing nodding heads. Okay, so it sounds like we have a little bit more work. We'll pick up, in the context of that change, then we may need to make additional changes down in 9.12. And then there is a logistical potential. There's a potential logistical issue here with commissioners attending a group session. And I'm just going to put this out there to chew on. Obviously, I don't have a position policy-wise whether they should or should not attend. But if a commissioner hears something in a group session that they have not gotten through the course of normal commission business, but they're subject to a duty of confidentiality on that, you're essentially asking them to unring the bell for purposes of the final report, because they know this, but they're also subject to confidentiality, so they have to be walling themselves off. And that's the potential concern for the commissioners attending. And it gets you back into that question of
if there's information that the commission is using to formulate its report, but it's subject to this duty of confidentiality, and they can't talk about it with each other. But at the same time, as a commissioner, when you've spent 3 years gathering testimony, you may not always remember which thing you heard in a group session and which thing you heard during an interview. And so it may be hard, and then you have the question of, well, where did you get that information? Where does that come from? And you lose some of that ability to track it to interviews and other things that may be in a factual record. I'm sorry to throw something in there, but it's that give and take there when you've got the confidentiality piece together with their duty to develop a report, even if it has redactions in it, they still have to prepare a public report.
So knowing that you got a little more work to do on the bill tomorrow and that it will have a couple more stops, I'm wondering, Michelle, if you can check in with the commissioners. For the time being, we'll leave it the way it is in draft 1.1 for that purpose.
Just briefly, I'm okay leaving that up to the commissioners, like, yes, that's a problem we've got to navigate. If you want to go to attend these things, then you've got to figure out how to manage that. Rather.
I should say we have a retreat tomorrow,
But
so I will definitely be able to check in with them. I'm assuming you're not expecting me to be here.
No,
Okay.
no, I think we're
I
gonna.
wanted to just clarify that.
Yep, that's fine. We're gonna continue working on this tomorrow afternoon, I think. And an announcement for the committee before we break is that judicial retention is using this room from 4:30 to 5:30. So if you could clear stuff off your desk, that would be great. We're gonna adjourn and go off live for now. Thanks, everybody.